This is a story my family told me when I was growing up. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and uncles were getting ready for bed. When outside they heard noises, as if someone was moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary, because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncle were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off in the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked toward the lights and started to move away, and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran towards the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car, and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking its head out to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes, rubbed over the gun, and placed the ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out into the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed, and the dark figure began running. My grandma chased my aunt inside and my uncles, and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the skinwalker is, say their name and it will kill them. My cousin lived in the eastern agency of the Navajo Nation in a community known as Crown Point. She was still living with her parents at this time and was a good girl. She had good grades, a nice ride, and was a very popular girl that played on the basketball team. When she told us this story, it was very out of the ordinary, and the events that followed would also deepen my beliefs in the traditional Navajo way and of the taboos associated with the Navajo culture. My cousin was coming home from basketball practice, which ran past sunset. It was during the colder months, and so it was dark by the time she pulled into her neighborhood. She pulled into the small housing community that she lived in. It was far from a fenced community, but there were streetlights, and the neighbors weren't too far from one another. As she neared her home, she saw a group of dogs. This wasn't unlikely, as there are random packs of stray dogs that roam rural communities. These dogs don't belong to anyone, and they get food where they can get it. As she got closer, she noticed that something was off about the dogs. There were 4 dogs, and they were sitting in a circle, all facing each other. This really didn't faze her until she spoke about the event later. Because this was a housing community, my cousin couldn't just barrel down the road, so she slowly drove past the group of dogs and kept going on her way. As she continued to drive, she noticed in her peripheral vision that something was running alongside her car. She turned her head to see that a brown dog from the group was trotting alongside her car. She didn't mind much until she hit a strategically placed speed bump. The impact of the bump made her entire car wobble. She looked over at the dog again, still casually keeping pace with the car. She tried to ignore the dog and tried speeding up, keeping in mind where the speed bumps were placed. The dog continued to keep pace. My cousin had to eventually stop at a stop sign. She began to feel immensely uncomfortable and tried to keep her eyes forward, but curiosity got the best of her. She looked over at the dog. It was facing forward. She continued to stare, and that is when the dog turned its head. Instead of the face of a dog, there was the flat face of a man covered in hair and smiling from ear to ear. Fear shot through her body, and my cousin pushed the pedal to the floor, not daring to look back in her rearview mirror. She reached her house and barely pulled herself in the door, weak from fear. My aunt came to her, and my cousin began to sob. She told my aunt everything, and they scheduled a meeting with a medicine man the next day. That night, my cousin was trying to get some rest. She was tossing and turning and felt very ill. She could hear people outside laughing and talking in Navajo, but she didn't think too much of it because they lived in a community near plenty of neighbors. At the medicine man, he told my cousin that she was very fortunate. The skinwalker wasn't meant for her. She just happened to spot it while it was out to bring another person misfortune. He also told her that the laughing and talking that she had heard in the night was the skinwalker talking to his friends, letting them know that someone had saw him and that he had scared her. The medicine man told my cousin that if the skinwalker had been for her and she had seen him like that, it could have very well killed her. After that encounter, my cousin suffered many ailments and had to stop playing basketball for a while. She had many ceremonies and eventually got back on her feet. My mom told us this story on many nights that our electricity went out. When I asked my cousin about it, she confirms it's true, but doesn't like talking about it much. I'll be posting more stories soon.